you hear me okay? Is the mic? So I'm just absolutely delighted to be here. I've said to everyone earlier, I think I want to be a journalist in the press. I don't want to be a journalist anymore. It seems much nicer. I'm also couldn't be happier to be in Victoria. I live in the south shore of Nova Scotia, which I think is very nice. But every time I come to British Columbia, I think, well, this is also nice here in British Columbia. And I feel I should thank the university and Deborah and the Southam family. I think the fact that the tragic death of Harvey Southam, that they chose to create this lecture series. I've seen similar things a couple different times in my career where people take a tragedy and try to make something positive about it. And I think that that's shows people at their best. And I say that in spite of my self-interest in the fact that I got to come. So thank you. I am from Nova Scotia, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people, Mi'kmaqi we say. I thought I'd start by talking about my early career as a journalist, partly because I hope that it will show some things about what's changed over the years in terrible ways, and it will help us see where we are now. So I grew up in a little town called Trudeau in central Nova Scotia, which is a railroad town, like many Canadian railroad towns. I later attended University of King's College in Halifax. I had hoped to, they have a journalism program there. I had hoped to attend that journalism program, but I was not able to be accepted to that journalism program, so I took a different program. So yeah, I was telling Deborah that I failed to get into King's because I was missing a grade 12 math class because I had been kicked out of the class for disciplinary reasons. And I suspect that that had something to do with the way that I wanted to be a crusading journalist, to right wrongs and cast light in dark shadows and lead to social reform. At the time, Woodward and Bernstein were the sort of archetypical hero journalists, Washington Post journalists who broke the Watergate story and ultimately led to the resignation of Richard Nixon. It's depressing and striking to think that the things that Nixon did that forced his resignation seem kind of trivial in comparison to the things that Donald Trump is doing out in the open. And I think that that's partly attributed to what I'm talking about today, which is polarization. Another sort of journalistic role model for me was the Nova Scotian Michael Harris, who often has articles in the Tyee. Michael, who's now become a friend of mine, was my hero when I was a young fella. He wrote this book, Justice Denied, The Law versus Donald Marshall. And it tells the story of Donald Marshall Jr., who is a Mi'kmaq young man, 19 years old, who was wrongly convicted of a murder that he didn't commit and spent 11 years in Dorchester Penitentiary. You look at the poor guy, eh? 19 years old, getting his mugshot in the pen full of hardened criminals. Lost a lot of the best years of his life there. And so Michael's work helped to lead to a public inquiry, which led to permanent and real changes in the justice system in Nova Scotia, which, it had been a very racist justice system, which was the only reason that this miscarriage of justice could happen. And his book, and I think it's very interesting to read it now, describing these sort of systemic racist problems in Nova Scotia. And it helped the society to deal with them and by revealing it to everyone, it helped create the impetus for change. So that's what I wanted to do as a journalist. My first job was at a small newspaper in Grand Falls, Newfoundland, in central Newfoundland, a pulp town, for a newspaper called The Advertiser, or some local people would say the Hadvertiser. A twice weekly newspaper
And I quickly discovered, without knowing very much at all about journalism, I started petrified. And I quickly discovered that it was going to take me a while before I got to right any wrongs or cast light into dark shadows, that I was going to write stories about the Salmon Festival and capelin prices and that kind of thing. It was a marvelous apprenticeship, but it was an apprenticeship to a trade. My first day, they gave me a stack of forms that I had to turn into obituaries. So here's the formula for writing obituaries, here's the people's names, and the whole process for my first months there was, they would say, go do this, and I would write it, and they'd say, that's not how you write that kind of story. Here's how you write that kind of story, and fix it up. I think that is a great experience, in part because you meet everyone in a town like that. You get a sense of how the community works, and when you make a mistake, you hear about it, right? You go to the rink or the Tim Hortons, and you see somebody you interviewed that week, and you say, well, how'd you like the story? You're thinking, he'll be very impressed at my marvelous writing. And he says, well, it was all right, but you spelled my brother's name wrong, right? And I really believe that being accountable to the people that you're interviewing and writing about is a fundamentally important thing about the business. The company that I work for had a number of newspapers, and I moved to 4 of them in the next couple of years, 5 of them, including the Carbonear Compass. I was the editor of the Labradorian in Goose Bay, Labrador. And I ended up at the Gander Beacon. I worked actually and got to know Michael Harris at the Express in St. John's, Newfoundland, where he did very important work exposing child abuse in the Catholic Church there. So I ended up at the Beacon, though, and I came across this photo while I was doing a bit of research to try to find old front pages from the newspapers where I'd worked. And I worked for that gentleman named Gerald Vokey, who was the business manager. He was not as interested in crusading injustice journalism as I was. And one day he said something to me that I really meant that I couldn't work there anymore. He said, "You're fired." And so I got in my crappy car. I remember those years as a lot of driving down snowy roads in crappy cars. That was a lot of what it was about. But it was fantastic. The people of Newfoundland are just the best. So I ended up back in Halifax, and I got a job on the night desk. Actually, I think they felt bad that they fired me, and they helped me get this job, which was then a scrappy progressive tabloid, which is not the normal thing. Usually tabloids are right-wing, but in this case, the dominant newspaper, the Chronicle Herald, was conservative. So as market positioning, it made sense for the other paper to be more left-leaning. And I spent years there on the night desk, kind of bored but learning. So being on the night desk, the reporters come in, and there's like 4 or 5 people who sit around and edit the copy and discuss it, and discuss grammar and story placement. And it's, again, a kind of an apprenticeship where you gradually kind of learn a bunch of things. Eventually, Conrad Black bought that newspaper. There's a lot of people who think Conrad Black did such marvelous things for the Canadian newspaper business because he launched the National Post, for example. But it was clear to me and my colleagues that he was not going to do anything good for the Halifax Daily News, and he was going to do what he always does with small papers, which is cut the newsroom budget by 10%. And we didn't think that. I remember one of my colleagues there saying, well, there's not 10% to cut here, and gradually people will stop reading it because there's not going to be anything in it. So I took a buyout in the hopes that I could get on at the Chronicle Herald, which I did. I worked there for quite a while, again, as a night editor. I was the front page editor on This Horrible Day, for example. I want to talk a little bit about the role of the monopoly broadsheet or dominant broadsheet, Halifax was once served by 5 daily newspapers. In the 1940s, by the 1940s, they had consolidated. Those newspapers reflected different political views. There was a conservative Catholic newspaper and a conservative Protestant newspaper. The society was kind of divided along political and sectarian lines. And so they did not always agree on what the important news was. The communities didn't necessarily all share the same stories. For business reasons, across North America, a similar sort of thing happened in most cities. I think it didn't happen until 1980 here in Victoria, when the Times and the Colonist became one newspaper. So what happens then, when you have this consolidation, is the people running the newspaper have to agree on a sort of news approach that is going to be acceptable to readers with different political perspectives. I think that these newspapers in this era were heavily influenced by wire service reporting standards. So there's a lot of what people sometimes critique as both sides journalism, where you say, well, this people say this and this people say that, and here's the story. And if you don't like it, we'll have a different story tomorrow. You know, like there was a sort of that kind of approach to political news, which I think was, in some ways, I'm kind of nostalgic for that, because there was a shared set of facts. There were problems with those newspapers and you know, the issues that they ignored and so on. But the other significant thing that I'm nostalgic for is the money. You could not sell anything in Nova Scotia for decades without giving the Chronicle Herald a taste. If you were selling snow tires or lingerie or a tugboat or potatoes, you had to advertise in the Chronicle Herald. So they always had lots of money. And they spent some of it. The family that owned it, the Dennis family, was committed to the well-being of Nova Scotia as they saw it. And the newspaper had a bureau in London, England. During the Quebec referendum in 1995, they sent 2 reporters to Quebec to travel around the province covering the referendum. They had budgets and they spent them. And they always had a bureau in Ottawa, which is where I ended up in 2004 as the Ottawa bureau chief. It was a bureau of 1, but I didn't tell people that. I'd say, well, I'm the bureau chief, you know. And I had an office in this building, which is now closed for renovations that are going to cost billions of dollars and take too long. But it was a marvelous experience, another kind of apprenticeship to be in what we call the hot room, which was a shared space for freelancers from all kinds of different news organizations. And it was marvelous to be there and sort of, you know, deal with the conservative Westerners and the Quebec separatists and all, you know, all these odds and ends and old guys telling war stories. And there's a picture of me where I'm scrumming Karl-Heinz Schreiber, the man who gave Brian Mulroney $300,000 in cash in envelopes. And I had so much fun covering federal politics, partly because I went for drinks with Karl-Heinz Schreiber, right? Like I had an angle on a story that I won't get into it, but that I felt kind of explained some of what happened between him and Mulroney. And he was facing extradition proceedings and continually hoping to make himself a story that would distract from, you know, or prevent that or whatever. And I went and had drinks with him and got a good story out of it. And I'll never forget him saying, Stephen, I'd like to have drinks with him like all the time. He was such an interesting man. Not an ethical man, I don't believe, but interesting. Stephen, I can see you really get it, Stephen. I'm going to tell you, I think, but you don't see the big picture. So I'm going to just explain this to you. And I think you're going to do a really good story. I spent a lot of time sitting in the gallery. The word press gallery means the actual gallery where you sit. That might be me up there. You see the fellow sitting up there above the right-hand shoulder of the speaker. So I used to go in to watch question period, which takes an hour a day, 4 days a week when the House is sitting. And you can learn an awful lot of boring things about Canada by listening to Question Period. At that time, a lot of MPs would come in and they would ask questions about things that were affecting their ridings, particularly opposition backbenchers. So you would learn in one question period that there were disputes about EI payments for striking workers at a fish plant in Glace Bay, Cape Breton. That there was allegations of corruption in the granting of a harbor dredging project in Quebec City. That Western farmers were upset about the freight rates that CN was charging, or about the capacity for CN, which the federal government would somehow find a way to blame the federal government for. That fishermen in the Fraser River were blaming the Department of Fisheries and Oceans for mishandling the salmon fishery. And I saw myself over and over again how it would work. So the MP from Cumberland Colchester would get up and ask his question and denounce the government, but later he would go, I would write a story about whatever it was, right? And I'd think, oh, there's this question about Nova Scotia. They're not going to fire me today because I've written a story, right? And then the next day, that MP would go after question period and walk across the house, across the floor to the minister and say, listen, people at home are really mad about this. Look at this story in the paper. You should do something about this, right? And then the minister would say, oh, geez, that's not good. And he would go and ask his officials, what, can you stop this? Like, I'm tired of these questions. This is making us look bad. And that's how the system worked. It really did work. It's not perfect, but there was, these newspapers played a role in this sort of cycle of conflict. One other thing I want to say about this time when I was covering Nova Scotia, at the time Nova Scotia had 11 MPs, and they were fairly evenly divided between Liberals, Conservatives, and New Democrats. My readers, I knew, supported all those parties, and others, would change depending on the election. I felt a responsibility to do my job and write stories and columns in a way that was fair to all of those people. Right? So I would say to the politicians, you think of them as voters, I think of them as readers, and I'm not going to, I'm going to try to be like an umpire and call strikes and balls and try my best to understand the perspectives of the supporters of all those parties. I sometimes found it challenging during the same-sex marriage debate in 2004. I saw that as a kind of human rights issue, and I struggled at times to sort of be even-handed in covering that. But for the most part, you could say, well, there's a bunch of people who have a bunch of different opinions and they're having an argument and here's what it looks like. Eventually, I got a job at the Postmedia newspapers, and with another reporter, Glenn McGregor, we had a big national scoop, a series of scoops. It was called the robocalls story about electoral wrongdoing in the federal election of 2011. What happened was the Conservatives, it's an established legal fact that in one riding, they sent thousands of opposition supporters to the wrong polling station using robocalls in a vain attempt to win that riding. There's a pattern that suggested they were doing the same thing in subtler ways across the country. That is not an established legal fact, but it was something that was, there was a lot of smoke, right? Anyway, I'll try not to go on about this, but I think it was interesting. We found out about this. I found out about it, I observed during the election that there were these weird phone calls taking place, and I started working on it. And after the election, I heard about what had happened in Guelph, Ontario, where this robocall went out. And I started interviewing sources and trying to figure it out. And eventually we pulled, after every election campaign, every candidate has to submit a folder full of expenses. And these guys who had, broken the law to try to win that riding, had submitted all their cell phone bills to account for their spending. And they had a record of every phone call that they made. So we spent like ages. We scanned them, digitized them, tried to figure out who the numbers belonged to, wrote scripts inspired by Sawatsky, who we were talking about earlier, and really prepared for this thunderous scoop. And there was one key moment when we discovered that 2 minutes after the call went out, someone in the office, after this fraudulent robocall went out, someone in that office called a robocall company in Edmonton that was associated with the Conservative Party of Canada. So we had the whole story wrapped up, and it made headlines, I'm sure, in the Victoria Times Colonist and across the country, and it led to big demonstrations, ultimately a federal court case, and changes to the Election Act to create new offenses to try to prevent this kind of thing, put a lot of pressure on the Harper government. Harper put Pierre Poilievre in charge of bringing in the new act, which seemed, he was a very partisan person to do that job. But McGregor and I were more than once compared to Woodward and Bernstein at that time, which is not really, you know, what we did was nothing like what they did. But that was, you know, pleasant for us. And I felt, well, there, I've done some of what I got into this business to do. I preferred the nickname that the Conservative caucus developed for us, which was the Hardy Boys. So that, digging up that story and causing all that trouble was good for both McGregor and I's careers. And I got to do a fellowship at Harvard for a year, a Nieman Fellowship, which meant that I could take whatever classes I want for a year at Harvard. In some ways, it's better than winning the lottery, because even if you win the lottery, you don't get to go to Harvard, right? It was just fantastic, except for one thing. Eventually, they made me leave, right? And they were firm about it at the end. I was like, well, I could just stay for another year, and that's not how this works, buddy. While I was there, I got to meet one of the reporters who did this story, which I think is just astonishing. These AP reporters had somehow been tipped off to slavery in Southeast Asia in fish plants and on fish boats, and they represented themselves as business reporters, talking about the incredible things that were happening in this area, but did all kinds of very amazing work that resulted in 2,000 people being freed. And I often think, you know, when people say, well, did you ever do anything interesting in your career? Well, I freed some slaves, right? So it's I think, an astonishing reminder of what journalism can do. When I came back from Harvard, Postmedia had changed, and there's an NDA that prevents me from talking about that, but I don't work there anymore, and I started freelancing for Maclean's. Which I really liked. The Ottawa Bureau of Maclean's had great people, people you probably know, Paul Wells, Shannon Proudfoot, Jason Markusoff covered Alberta. It was a weekly news magazine with a long and glorious tradition. And now it is not. Now it is a monthly. Now it doesn't have any reporters on staff. All of the news organizations where I have worked in my career are either gone or a shadow of their former selves. The first 6 newspapers where I worked, all those papers in Newfoundland, the first paper in Halifax, are all closed. The Chronicle Herald, the Dennis family ultimately had to sell it to Postmedia. They just laid off their last sort of popular local columnist this week. My mother called me not long ago and said, what's this going on in the Herald? Who's this Brian Lilly? Who's a right-wing columnist out of Toronto. So they're running all the, you know, national stuff. I looked up the Labradorian website where I had worked, and now it is an advertisement for gambling apps that you can put on your phone. This is a recent front page of the Chronicle Herald where they've sold a wrap to the province of Alberta, some kind of pipeline, kind of nonsense propaganda. What happened is that Google and Facebook offered advertisers a better way to sell snow tires and tugboats and potatoes, and that's the whole story. That's what happened. I think that Canadian journalists have had a harder time. Canadian journalist organizations have had a more difficult time than maybe in any other country. The same process has happened elsewhere, but we have a special problem in that Canadians are very interested in the United States, right? If you look at countries where the media remains very healthy, they're often minority language countries like Norway. Quebec maintains a stronger ecosystem because people can't necessarily just read the New York Times. Whereas if you look at the list of the percentage of people in Canada who subscribe to a foreign paper, it's 50% in Canada. The only other country with a similar rate is up a little higher is Ireland, which is kind of a similar circumstance. It's a smaller English-speaking country. I assume they're all subscribing to the Times or the Telegraph or something. So about 500 news outlets have closed since 2008. The blue ones are the newspapers that have closed, and the orange ones are the openings. This has affected our political system in, I think, a very negative way. I was in question period 2 weeks ago, last week, and where they used to be asking questions about the Glace Bay fish plant and so on, now the Conservatives, one after another, are standing up and reading the same question, saying, Mark Carney has promised that grocery prices would go down. Beef is up 20%. Bacon is up 15%. Why did he lie? Why blah, 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 blah. One after another, they're doing that. And the reason they're doing that is there's no point in them asking about the salmon in the Fraser River, because Peter O'Neill, who was for many years the Vancouver Sun and Province correspondent, is not there anymore. They can ask those questions. It will not get a story in the paper anyplace, right? So instead, what they are doing is asking a little question so that they can do a Facebook video clip and portray it to their local Conservative voters as, look, I'm taking on Carney. I'm telling Carney what to try to get engagement. And I don't actually really blame them. Like, the system is no longer working the way it was designed to work, though. The newspapers were a crucial part of the whole democratic process. People, it's my belief that people's votes are only as valuable as their understanding of their government, right? Without public understanding and of what the government is doing, then what are you voting on? The Liberals, to give them their due, the Trudeau government provided money to bail out the newspapers. I don't think that they did it in the smartest or best way, but I'm glad that the Toronto Star and the Postmedia papers are still being published. But they did something else that didn't work out very well, which is the Online News Act, where they threatened, they told Facebook that if Facebook didn't pay up and provide funding for a newspaper fund, they would take the money from them, and Facebook said, well, we'll just stop running news. We'll block Canadian news sites from our network. People aren't coming to Facebook for news anyway, is what they said. And look at the cliff. So all kinds of small, especially some of the online-only startups, it just strangled their growth. It was murder. The other thing that happened, I think that accelerated a lot of our problems in the Canadian news media was COVID, in that people were sitting at home alone. They were often in a psychologically vulnerable state. and new avenues of information were opened up to reach people. I want to play you a little audio clip here. A woman named Linda Hartley in small town New Brunswick got this in her messenger and later forwarded it to me.
Okay, so I am a natural doctor and I have 1,600 patients. Many are vaccinated. Just to give you a little bit of backstory about my credibility. What I've seen so far and what I've learned is all information from physicians, medical physicians, natural physicians, and also immunization, virology doctors, things like that, and then also nurses. So what I'm about to share with you is the first vaccine, the second vaccine, and then the boosters and what it does to your body. The first vaccine, as it goes into your body, it has a small amount of saline and then a bunch of ingredients that are very catastrophic to your cellular system. What that does to your immune system, which is your bone marrow, your thymus gland, your spleen, and all other systems associated with your immune system, it decreases the ability to produce white blood cells by 50% from your first vaccine. Then 8 weeks later, which is white blood cell reproductive system, so your ability to make another generation of white blood cells is 8 weeks. That's why they set it up 8 weeks later to hit it again. So you hit the white blood cell ability while it's down. So now what you do is now they decrease the saline in the second one and they increase the harmful ingredients. So now you have a shift in the ingredients. So they decrease the saline and increase. So now there's a shift. And then what they do is that second dose attacks your ability to make white blood cells by an additional 25%.
The reason that Linda Hartley sent that to me is because when she ended up intubated, there's a photo of her, and they were saying, why didn't you get vaccinated? She said, well, I got all this stuff from Facebook that told me that it would kill me. It was part of this big, complicated plot. And she went public to try to warn other people against vaccine misinformation. I found this quite troubling. In all my years in the newspaper business, nobody, I don't think, ever succeeded in publishing medical misinformation in one of my newspapers. They would just fire your ass if you tried to do anything like that. So Facebook has allowed for a huge quantity of very carefully assembled misinformation. I've listened to this many times and tried to kind of guess. It sounds like maybe it's an actor. It's quite a sophisticated message in a way. And it's really hard to know who would be motivated to try to do that. But there were a lot of hucksters selling vitamins and quack cures. And a part of their business model was to tell people, you don't need the vaccine. You need Dr. Jeff's miracle paste, right? That's part of the problem. I also am suspicious of the Russians, to be honest with you. They do more misinformation than we realize, I think, and want to create discord in our societies. So all of this stuff that has happened has greatly weakened the mainstream media. I'm going to play a clip here of Andrew Scheer. This is from 2020, his last moments as leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. It was after Aaron O'Toole took over. I think this was likely a tough moment for Mr. Scheer. He had not wanted to give up the leadership of the party, and this speech that he gives, I think he's an angry man, and he blames the media for the election, his election loss to Justin Trudeau.
Think, challenge the mainstream media. Don't take their narrative as fact. Check out smart, independent, objective organizations that are growing all the time, like the Postmedia or True North. There are other places to get information. Let's stop being the silent majority. Don't be afraid to challenge leftist professors or public figures. Millions of Canadians share our conservative values. They just don't all know it yet.
So one of the outlets there, and if there are any leftist professors here, I'd like to apologize for that. One of the outlets he mentioned there was True North. It's since rebranded as Juno News, and it's funded by donors. I don't know who the donors are, but it's very aggressive, conservative content. Here's a clip from during the election, the most recent election.
Hi, I'm Candace Malcolm, and this is the Candace Malcolm Show, and we are breaking some news, an exclusive story that just came out on Juno News, that Mark Carney, Canada's new Prime Minister, sent his daughter, his eldest daughter, Sasha, to the Tavistock Clinic, the transgender clinic in the UK, for treatment with regards to gender dysphoria. This happened when Sasha was a teenager. She lived in the UK from age 13 to 17, and during that time, she went to the Tavistock Clinic.
So I've been covering politics for a long time, and I have spent a fair amount of time snooping into the private lives of politicians, and normally not writing stories about it, but you don't always know before you snoop around if there's something newsworthy there. And there is a kind of line. You don't go after people's children. You try to, unless there's a very good reason, leave their private lives, their marriages alone. If we want people to do these jobs, we shouldn't make their lives hellish, right? We need somebody to be the Prime Minister of Canada, to be the Minister of Fisheries, to be the Mayor of Victoria. I believe that there's a sort of sliding scale. The invasiveness of the media should be proportionate to the job. So if you want to be president of the United States, until this guy, you would release your tax records, you would release your medical records. That's a very important job. It's necessary. We don't need to know as much about the Prime Minister of Canada. It's not as important a job. We need to know a lot less about the Mayor of Victoria, right? So that's the way I see it. So this is going so far over the line in a way that I find disheartening, I would say. And if Candace was here, she would have an argument for defending it, that because these gender issues are important and Carney's going to be in charge of the country. I don't buy it, but it is a free country, and I think she should have the legal right to do this. But I don't think it's particularly healthy, and it's a sign of polarization. It's not all kind of bad, crazy stuff. The collapse of the mainstream media has created space for other organizations like the Tyee, like the Narwhal. I think that they're doing good work. A lot of there's some interesting business organizations like the Logic. They've found an interesting subscription model. I'm not a big fan of the Rebel News, but they, their subscribers like it, I guess. I'm grateful all the time for the CBC, that as the newspapers and magazines have collapsed, at least we have the CBC. I think it may have its problems, but it's a vital part of our national sovereignty. That's not the opinion of Pierre Poilievre, right? Pierre Poilievre, it's not the opinion, like if you look at polling on this, the majority of conservative supporters in Canada do not want to see CBC defunded. I really wish that Pierre Poilievre had a platform to change, to reform, to transform, even fairly radical ways, the CBC. But that's not his policy. He wants to get rid of it. And to keep Radio-Canada, which to me just seems like absolutely ridiculous. This is so different from the history of the Conservative Party of Canada. The CBC was founded by Prime Minister Bennett, who was a Conservative. There was a long, sort of common-held view that CBC was necessary. Poilievre, when he was at his highest in the polls, was also going after CTV. There was one news clip where, in a sort of technical error, they ended up garbling one of his quotes, and it was slightly misleading. And they seized on this as a sort of culture war thing. And CTV panicked and fired the reporters. Poilievre was going after the CEO of Bell, right? So at this time, he was sure he was going to be in the Prime Minister's office and signaling, I know people around him, and I'd be talking, are they really going to get rid of CBC? They're talking about getting rid of the CRTC, right? They're talking about totally transforming the Canadian media environment and really, really opening it up. So that CTV story that went sideways happened because Bell doesn't really want to be in the news business anymore. They make the vast majority of their money from cell phone services and whatnot. And this used to be kind of a profitable thing and something they could be proud of. But as the advertising revenue has disappeared, it's just become a pain in the ass to them. And they don't, it was causing this big problem. And so to save money, they got rid of their stars. Lisa Laflamme was an extraordinarily tough-minded and effective journalist, a ratings hunter. She was really something. They got rid of her. They got rid of Rosa Huang, the producer who'd worked closely with Laflamme for many years. Joyce Napier, who was their Ottawa bureau chief. And my old colleague and friend, Glenn McGregor, who is seen here getting heckled by protesters during the convoy. This is the attitude of a big part of the conservative movement about what's happening in the Canadian media. Not the majority necessarily, but a significant part. And Poilievre is in that stream. I think that they are influenced by what's happening in other places. Viktor Orban in Hungary told CPAC, a conservative conference, that you should have your own media. And in Hungary, they have found ways to silence news organizations that are offside. So, all this fragmentation in the media environment has led to political polarization. One striking example, you can look at the polling here, 45% of conservative supporters like Donald Trump, almost nobody else does. When I published this book called The Prince, a book about the Trudeau government last year, and I feel I should tell you that there's now a paperback edition with a new afterword, and also they're selling it outside, and Christmas is coming, right? So while I was trying to flog that book, while I was working on it, I was thinking about the history of the Liberal Party of Canada, and it looked like it was about to, like Justin was going to drive the truck into the ditch and the Liberals were going to be wiped out. So I started doing something that while I was working on the book, I didn't have time to do, but I'd been wanting to do for some time, is to tabulate all of the legislatures in Canada, including the Parliament in Ottawa, and track over time the party standings. And what finally got me, motivated me to do this, for one thing, I wanted to get a story in the Globe to try to promote my book, but also this guy, John Rustad, had brought about the end of the Liberal Party of British Columbia. Although it wasn't called the Liberal Party of British Columbia by the end. What was it called? The British Columbia Party? The United Party, yeah. So that meant, once they rebranded, there is now, and there was when I wrote the article, one Liberal in a provincial parliament from west of Thunder Bay. That is unusual in Canadian history. There were always Liberals in Manitoba. They sometimes formed government in Saskatchewan. And we have seen polarization over time. And now Quebec's always infinitely more complicated because of the national question. They've got a bunch of parties there. In Ontario, I think that either the Liberals or the New Democrats are likely going to fade eventually. Atlantic Canada are mostly two-party legislatures now. And in this article, I was predicting the end of the Liberal Party. That's not how things turned out. It's why I shouldn't make predictions. But we do, in the last federal election, we had the wipeout of other parties. So we're seeing a polarization in Canada in our legislatures, unlike our past. And you kind of see it happening here. Peter Newman, who was an important longtime Canadian journalist, wrote that for much of our history, the two parties were separated mostly because one was in power and the other one wanted to be. Unlike in the United Kingdom or the United States or Australia, our politics did not become as ideological. There's good political science research that suggests that that's because of the regional and linguistic complexity of Canada, that we need these parties to be sort of brokerage systems, particularly around Quebec. So the Liberals are traditionally the party that acts as a broker between the interests of Quebec and Ontario, and the rest of the country will have to try to find a way to fit into this. Anyway, that was the way things were. It seems to be changing. It's not as stark as in the United States, but it is stark. How would you feel if you had a son or daughter married to somebody who supported the opposite political party? It used to be that a very small percentage of people would find that upsetting. That number has increased dramatically in the United States. It's about 16 points lower in Canada, but increasing. It's not as bad here as it was in the United States, as it is in the United States. I want to play two bits of video associated with the Charlie Kirk assassination. Here's Kerry.
How does a 22-year-old become so filled with hate? 5 years earlier, I was told he was a Trump supporter. And we sent our kids off to college and they brainwashed him. I am making a plea to mothers out there. Do not send your children into these indoctrination camps. Don't do it. Do not do it.
The accused shooter in the Charlie Kirk case did a semester during COVID, and we don't know if he was ever on a college campus, right? What she's saying is nonsensical and demonstrates how universities are associated with the polarization. This is a statement from the House of Commons. I happened to be in the House of Commons the day that the MP, Rachel Thomas, a Conservative MP from Lethbridge, Alberta, who did some interesting research. She's an evangelical Christian, quite impressive, did interesting research on struggles that the evangelical church is facing before she became a member of parliament. So I suspect that Charlie Kirk, who's a Christian, was meaningful to her. She stood in the House and gave this.
Freedom of speech is the cornerstone of a free society. It means we will hear ideas that we disagree with and express views that may be offensive. This freedom can make us uncomfortable or even hurt, but silencing voices, whether for a moment or forever, is never the answer. We must protect a society where people can hold beliefs and share opinions without fear of losing their jobs, being censored, or worse. Charlie Kirk was an outspoken advocate for faith, family, and freedom. Many disagreed with him, some were offended. Tragically, on September 10th, he was assassinated in an attempt to silence his voice. But when has political violence ever been the solution? It destroys dialogue, it undermines democracy, and it breeds fear instead of understanding. True progress comes from persuasion, not intimidation. As we grapple with our personal response to this, may we be honorable in our actions. May we fiercely defend the right of our opponents to speak freely. And may we join our hearts with Charlie's family, his wife Erica, and his 2 young children. Rest in peace.
Now, what's going on there, I find is interesting. You can kind of see at the end, the Liberals wait a minute, and they look to see what Carney wants them to do, and he stands up and applauds. Most members of the House of Commons applauded that speech. The New Democrats didn't, and some Liberals did not. Charlie Kirk was a hater and a racist. But I think that there's something positive about the fact that the people in our House of Commons could express sympathy to his family and demonstrate unity. And I think it was interesting that Rachel Thomas is not there trying to make divisions. She's writing a speech that I think she hopes the Liberals will be able to stand and applaud. So she's looking for unity rather than division there. The emotions that are driving someone like Kerry Lake to say these really hateful things that were driving Charlie Lake, I think I've looked at a lot of the sociology around this. Pippa Norris and the late Ronald Inglehart believe that it is a cultural backlash. That for many people with traditional values, the changes in society have been profoundly unsettling for them. Changes around sexuality, the rise of a new multicultural class, the sort of rise in women's equality has produced a powerful backlash, and that gave us, first in Italy, Berlusconi, it's given us Trump, it provided energy to Pierre Poilievre's movement, and we're still sort of dealing with that. The social revolution that's taken place since like the 1960s and the way that it has changed our ideas about how society should be ordered has produced a powerful backlash, and it's wise to be aware of how powerful and emotional it is. I found this book by Ezra Klein at the New York Times about what's been happening. It's very useful. And Canadian professor Eric Merkley has done good research on it. Half of Canadians believe that the system has become too extreme. During the course of the Trudeau years, the Liberals became increasingly progressive. The polling and the Conservatives became increasingly conservative. They are becoming ideological rather than brokerage parties. This is not necessarily entirely negative. There's something called sorting. I've looked at polling from like 1993, issues polling, and when they ask people, what do you think is more important, the environment or jobs? Right, and they ask these same questions over many years, so you can kind of get a sense. In the 1990s, conservatives and liberals had about the same level of response to that, and the New Democrats were way off on their own on the environment being more important. Now, Liberal and NDP supporters are clustered together, and the Conservatives are off somewhere else. Brian Mulroney might be the most environmentally conscious Prime Minister in Canadian history. It was not a partisan issue at that time. It is now a partisan issue, and that's been a kind of division. You can have a long think about whether it's good or bad that our parties are more ideological. In one way, it makes elections have kind of more meaning because you're voting for an ideology rather than whether you prefer Joe Clark to Pierre Trudeau. Nonetheless, it's happening. During this period of growing and intensifying polarization, Canadians are having less trust in the news media. That may be because the news media is under attack from new outlets and weird Facebook misinformation messages, and from the Conservatives. but I think the media and journalists have become polarized at the same time as the rest of society. And our newsrooms have become more diverse in some ways, but not more intellectually or ideologically diverse. And we tend to be increasingly associated with universities. Universities are a focus of polarization, and they're resented by many people, not as badly as in Canada, but we could see Kerry Lake hates universities, right? And they associate journalists with universities. So I think that's something to think about. And I think that also journalists should be thinking about that, and they should be aware that many people view them with suspicion, and they should be more careful than they always are. This is from an interview with a community newspaper editor, and
on the topic, I mean, in terms of your sort of strategy currently, you're obviously taking the populist pathway.
What does that mean?
Well, appealing to people's more emotional levels, I would guess. I mean,
What do you mean by that?
certainly you tap very strong ideological language quite frequently.
Like what?
Left wing, you know, this and that, right wing, you know, I mean, it's that type of ideological spectrum.
I never really talk about left
But
or right.
anyways, a lot of
I don't really believe in that.
Okay. A lot of people would say that you're simply taking a page out of the Donald Trump book.
Like which people would say that?
Well, I'm sure a great many Canadians, but
Like who?
I don't know who, but...
Well, you're the one who asked the question, so
yeah.
you must know somebody.
Okay. I'm sure there's some out there, but anyways, the point of this question is, I mean, why should Canadians trust you with their vote, given, you know, not just the sort of ideological inclination in terms of taking the page out of Donald Trump's book, but
What are you
also,
talking about? What page? What page? Can you give me a page? Give me the page. You keep saying that.
in terms of turning things quite dramatically in terms of Trudeau and the left wing and all of this. I mean, you make quite a, you know, it's quite a play that you make on it. So I'm
not
just
sure.
wondering.
I don't know what your question
Okay,
is.
then forget that. Why should Canadians trust you with their vote?
Common sense.
Okay.
Common sense for a change. We're going to make common sense common.
so that guy, Don Urquhart, I'm sure he's doing good community journalism all the time. But that was not probably his best outing, right? That's not what he does for a living, is deal with somebody like Pierre Poilievre. That clip was probably Poilievre's most successful social media video ever. It was on Joe Rogan. Elon Musk shared it. It helped bring him to the attention of international conservatives, further burnishing him in the minds of Canadian conservatives. One thing I want to say about it is Pierre Poilievre is a bully, right? So he was in a mismatch there with somebody who was really not prepared to deal with him. The guy keeps asking, his question is basically, and forgive my bad language, why are you such an asshole? Right? Like, that's not a good question. So to point out how Poilievre is a bully, at the time of the Fair Elections Act, when he brought in this act, I was probably the reporter in the press gallery who knew the most about it and writing about it a lot because it was brought in response to the scandal we dug up. And he would never give me an interview. And in an unrelated interview with a Globe reporter in 2023, he's complaining that I caused death threats to him, right? So he'll never give me an interview because I would have a good question for him. That's kind of like a key to Pierre Poilievre. But the other thing that strikes me about that is I would also not ask him that question, why are you such an asshole? Because I don't actually, there's a lot of things I disagree with, but I have a lot of respect for his political skills. I have a lot of respect. What's important is I have a lot of respect for the people who he represents. He brought the issue of housing, the problem that especially young people have for housing. He really made a difference in Canadian public policy by promoting that. So I respect what he does. That he has a role in the system, and I try not to be polarized. I try to see him for as a representative of a lot of people in our country. And I think that sometimes we are struggling in the mainstream media to see other perspectives as legitimate. When I was working on the Trudeau book, I started to think that it became clear that immigration was becoming a big problem. They let in huge numbers of people after COVID, temporary foreign workers, and students, international students. And I talked to liberals behind the scenes after they started to see that this was turning into a problem, who said, obviously nobody was thinking any of those thoughts. I can't remember any conversations about like, hey, all these temporary foreign workers, where are we going to put them? How are they going to find a dentist? So it was a huge miscalculation, in my opinion, maybe the biggest public administration error in a decade or two, that we suddenly have tent encampments. And some people often say to me, well, immigration didn't cause the tent encampments, housing policy caused the tent encampments. I'm like, yeah? Where did all those people there? Look at all those people. Where did they end up living, right? Like it's supply and demand. There's a relationship. And I didn't see a single column during this period, and I didn't write one, saying, well, this immigration policy that the Liberals are doing is going to cause a lot of problems. I would not want to write that column because I don't want a bunch of people thinking I'm against immigrants or that I'm racist or that I'm, you know what I mean? Like, I would feel intimidated. And I think that there's a lot of that kind of feeling. I started to think about this more. So this is an tent encampment in Halifax on Grand Parade, which was built in, it's a central square in downtown Halifax, built in 1749 when the city was built. Sort of our most sacred public park in a way. For ages, it was full of people staying in tents. Now this is a very serious, difficult problem. There have always been homeless people, but suddenly there were homeless people who have jobs, who can't afford a place to live, and there were a lot more of them. And for every one person in a tent, there's probably 100 sleeping on their sister's couch or in a camper or something, right? It's a very serious problem. But I noticed that the coverage in the Halifax media of this issue tended to be stories about, well, the city's thinking about moving some of these people out of these parks, and you know, the politicians are kind of justifying why they might do that. And I was never seeing the perspective of people who use the park and didn't want a bunch of people living in tents there. It was just not in the coverage. And I was at a political event talking to the strategist for a mayoral candidate who had taken a kind of anti-encampment position. And I said, why are you guys taking that position? That seems like it'd be unpopular. And she said, well, have you seen the polling? The polling shows that a significant percentage of the people in Halifax do not think that there should be tents in our most important parks. And I started thinking about that. I think that there's a pretty good feminist argument, in a way, for not allowing tent encampments in these urban parks. If you look at research on how women can come to feel unsafe in public spaces, particularly adolescents, there's good research that shows that when places when there's disorder, that suddenly, especially adolescent girls, will stop going in public, they'll be fearful. One of the big tent encampments was on a median strip near the hospitals. I'm told that nurses no longer felt safe walking to work. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't have encampments in parks, or that you should. That's a political argument. I am saying that it should be in the story. If a lot of people in your city feel that the encampments are a problem and we should do something about it, it's weird if that's not in the story. So I think that we are having a kind of group think, and the journalists should be thinking about that. I think that part of it has to do with the growing influence of the academy and universities. It used to be more of a trade, and as it's become a profession, I think that we have generations of students coming from journalism school into the newsroom where they're used to sort of thinking of themselves as sharing insight and expertise from professors with the public. That's an important part of the job, and that's like half of what I do is talk to professors and try to understand things and write at a high level. But another part of the job is talking to people in Tim Hortons and hockey rinks and finding out how they feel about things and including them in the story, right? So I think that that's, I don't know if that will help us maintain the trust of the 46% of Canadians who still trust the mainstream media, but I think that it's a good thing to be thinking about. Marty Barron, the legendary editor of the Washington Post during the first Trump period, says the message should be check my work. And I think that that's a good message. And it's easier to say check my work if you have represented both sides of the debate over tent encampments, in my opinion. It's a tough business. It's getting tougher to make a living in the business. Some unknown person, their advice to writers was seek truth, marry money. One of the things that I'm sort of nervous about is happening is that it's journalism is becoming more of a hobby job for people whose spouses are the primary breadwinners, or Nepo babies, people who do not need to raise a family and feed themselves. So I'm somewhat nervous about how that will influence the work product going on. It's such a tough business that people are exiting and they're taking jobs working in communications at universities, working for unions, for government, and doing media training and so on. And that's life. I get why people leave, but and it can be really depressing to think about this industry that has shrunk so much and the way that we are not able to tell as many stories and do as much. On the other hand, we're still doing so much amazing work, and there's so much light that can be yet cast into dark corners and so many injustices that can be made right. So in a way, I don't lose faith in the industry. It just got smaller. Perhaps there'll be some new models that come along. People are doing interesting things. And I think that the difficulties in the business, if anything, means that the people who are able to keep doing it should be more committed to doing it as vigorously and successfully as they can, right? So it really is a fantastic thing to do, in my opinion, to be a journalist. All right, I've talked longer than I was supposed to, I think. I got going. Do we have time for some questions?
We have a little bit of time for questions, so I'll bring the microphone around. One question I have for you is, one thing that I think that in some ways the left and right in Canada agree on is they don't want to pay for news. You see a lot of people who just won't subscribe, even when it's not that expensive, but their cell phone bill and their cell phone costs are very expensive, or their 6 streaming services are very expensive. So do you have any thoughts about that? Is it somewhat our civic responsibility to ensure that journalists can make a living so they can actually report by paying for it?
Yes, but me saying that isn't going to make them do it, I don't think. You know what I mean? I'm not optimistic about that.
Yeah.
I am optimistic about some of the startups like The Logic, All Nova Scotia, that are succeeding in selling subscriptions, but it's largely a business model.
Yeah, or Tyee, who were reader-funded, where
Yeah.
the readers...
Canada Land,
yeah.
the Narwhal. And, you know, I'd like to see more of that.
Yeah. Some questions here? Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. You showed a graph of Canadians, I think, trust in the media, and you had it broken out by English and French, and it looked like I'm not sure it was statistically significant, but it looked like the French number was higher.
Yeah.
Any sense of why that might be?
Well, Quebec, and it's not entirely Quebec, but likely mostly Quebec, because they are, in North America, minority language. I think that they feel a greater attachment to La Presse and Le Devoir and TVA. TVA is a very successful news station and Radio Canada. So it's sort of in their culture, and they also value their film industry and their publishing industry and their, I think that it's, you know, an important part of Quebec, which would go back to the idea of la survivance, the survival, right? That's a dominant historical narrative in Quebec, is they tried to destroy us and they couldn't, right? Like that's the focus of their pride in Quebec, and I would guess that's associated with their media organizations.
So not necessarily lessons that are going to translate to save us.
No, the La Presse at one time had a very successful tablet product, and the Toronto Star hired that idea, and it didn't work in Toronto. It works in Montreal, it didn't work in Toronto.
Hi. Do you see a future where news in a conventional form, like newspaper, et cetera, returns to Facebook or Meta platforms?
I hope so. I hope that Mark Carney, smart as he is, can figure out a way to do that. And yeah, because it's pretty awful. And a huge mistake by the Trudeau government. They were trying to do something good, but it didn't work. And if they'd been a little smarter, they might have realized that.
My question's about, I know you were talking a bit about how hard the business is now and how hard it is to make a living as a journalist. Do you think if you were a young person starting your career today that you still would have gone into journalism? And how do you think your life would be different if you started as a journalist now versus as when you did?
I find it disturbing to think that no one will ever get their start at the Grand Falls Advertiser. No one will ever get to learn about covering federal politics as the bureau chief for a regional paper, right? Like, so these things are gone. On the other hand, there are good careers in the business, and there's interesting startups. You know, it's harder, but it's not impossible.
Thank you. We live in an age of fascism, from the war in Ukraine to the genocide in Gaza. If it wasn't for the support of and biases of the media, the genocide in Gaza could not happen. But we have a problem greater than the biases of the journalists, and that's the concentration of media ownership. If you could possibly comment on it, concentration of media ownership in Canada and globally. Thank you.
Well, I find I am not. I follow events in Gaza very closely, but I feel not particularly qualified to talk about it in a substantive way, and the relationship to business ownership. Like, we have seen an enormous shift in public sympathy since the beginning of the war. So the business ownership has not prevented people in Italy, where they're shutting down the ports. Spain this week announced they were going to change the, stop exporting arms to Israel. So we can see that whatever the concentration of business ownership, people have got the news, and there are many different sources. And I constantly see kind of very emotional debates on the internet about the coverage provided by the BBC, for instance, which is obviously owned by the people of Britain. So I'm basically going to try to dodge that, to be honest with you. But thank you. Mr. Trump announced that there's going to be peace. Let's hope so.
Yeah, peace in our time. Thanks for your presentation, very interesting. A few years ago, John Cruikshank, I think, was the editor of the Globe and Mail. He wrote a book called Mass Disruption. Just at the, I think it was really much at the front end of everything that's happened, with social media and everything else. There seems to be a fundamental problem with the advertising model, and the whole thing has been taken over by these, Meta and all these people, and there's no way of wresting it from their control, because the U.S. Department of Justice, they're not doing anything on the antitrust front. Canada can't really do anything because, of course, we had the issue about the digital services tax, and government's kind of folded its tent on that thing about this. So there is a concentration problem, but it's not where it may have been suggested earlier. It's in the advertising thing, right?
Yeah.
It's a funnel that goes through those big companies. The other thing is John Cruikshank said at a presentation here in Victoria, again, 5 or 6 years ago, he said, when the last local newspaper closes, democracy is in big trouble. Like, we can find out what Trump's doing every 5 minutes. Go on CNN, go look at CNBC, anything on cable news, Wall Street Journal covers it, New York Times, all the big media outlets in the U.S. We can find out anything we want about the U.S. administration and what it's doing. How do you find out what City Hall is doing if you don't have a local newspaper? Yeah, we can, but not every town has that. Grand Falls and is it Grand Falls?
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't have it anymore.
Very depressing because so many municipal governments are kind of low-key corrupt in Canada and probably everywhere because they control the land where developments can happen. And the local reporter, you don't have to be Woodward Bernstein to go to the meeting and write about what happened, right? And create a record, and people say, oh, they're going to develop that land down behind the mall. It's the mayor's buddy getting that, right? Like, nobody even knows about that. No. You don't have a reporter. No. So, like, at the same time, the number of people working in communications, right, like press secretaries and has exploded. Every public organization. Well, the jobs are for journalists. Yeah. So that's another thing I'm worried about is that it becomes a training ground. You work for a year or two, and then you get the job at the, and I don't blame the people who do that, but it's depressing. And I'm entirely sure that whatever money we spend subsidizing local news is worth it for the democracy, right? Like, I don't like it. I don't like the way, I don't like when conservatives say, well, you're just saying that because you're in the pocket of Trudeau because he's paying your bills. For one thing, because I'm like, a book company paid me to write that book, and come here and I'll punch you in the mouth. You know what I mean? Like, I get very angry about it. But overall, they're not entirely wrong. I'm worried about this, that the media is taking all this money. So it's very challenging. I wish there was more emphasis on tax credits for subscriptions, so that it basically would cost you nothing or very little to subscribe to whatever paper you want to. And that way the government isn't picking and choosing who gets the money. I think that might be better. But I agree, like the Liberals, probably they didn't really want to create this great big fund and give money to all the newspapers, including Postmedia, which is owned by a hedge fund and they're buddies with Trump, or they were. It's not good.
Thank you for the work you're doing. You touched on misinformation. I'm wondering if you could expand on that a bit and talk about who, what, where, how are we going to address this exponential growth in bullshit that we've got to wade through?
It's very difficult. I've done a fair bit of reporting on it. And like a lot of people got black-pilled during COVID, right? Like a certain percentage of the population just got sucked down these information pipes. And it's the fundamental nature of the internet. There's a concept called dark advertising, where advertisers or propagandists are able to target individuals, and it's not done in the public square, right? That message is only getting to them. I thought a good example of that was during the 2016 American election. The Russians, it was eventually revealed, were doing all of these anti-Hillary Clinton ads funneled through fake Black Lives Matter organizations saying, Hillary's a cop, you know, don't support Hillary, she's bad, by people pretending to be Black Lives Matter activists, right? So we don't know where the, we don't even know if what messages our neighbor's getting, right? Because it's a one-way pipe and it's private. And I had hope that some of the European approaches to regulating the social media platforms would be positive, but with Trump in the White House and these guys bringing him, you know, influencing him so much, I find it's kind of difficult to imagine that kind of regulation, which is sophisticated. The EU is moving there, and I'd like to see it happen in Canada, but I'm not counting on it anytime soon.
Hi, we live in a time right now where professional journalism as an industry is smaller than it's ever been, pretty much. And yet there's this rising amount of people who consider themselves journalists because they run, say, a podcast or a blog or something independent, so they consider themselves to be spreading news or what have you. And I'm wondering if you could comment on how that could have potentially influenced people's perception and trust of the media as people who kind of position themselves as media, even though they might not have the credential or profession to go with it.
You see that especially on the right, like these people who are influencers around Polyev, for example. And the first thing I think about is they have the legal right to do that. And they may not share the professional values of professional journalists, but if they are in the business of expressing opinion and sharing views, they are journalists. Whether they actually make their living doing it or not, that's the kind of question to me. So they kind of freak me out. You know, some of them are very strange. Some of them, it was revealed last year that some of them in Canada were getting money from the Russians, right? And the Russians, over and over again, the more I sort of watch them and look at history and stuff, they've been running disinformation since they wrote the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the early part of the 20th century, and we only see part of what they're doing. So, yeah. On the other hand, people want to express themselves and share their views, even if I disagree with them. I think we live in a free society, good for you. You know, I think that it's good to keep that in mind.
I wanted to circle back a bit to the local news question, and I wanted to hear your opinion. I mean, you've worked a lot. You got your start in local news and these small town issues. And back then, obviously, it was worth people's time to pick up the paper and read about local issues. But do you think nowadays it's a matter of just building it back and people will come and read? Or do you think in the new attention economy, do you think there's even a place for local news in people's media consumption? Do you think people will be picking up these stories even if they're written?
I think so. I think they will. People do have so many more options now that, you know, you can look at TikTok all day and, but I do think that people are, especially when they get to the phase in their life when they have a family, have a home, and they start to think about their school and their municipal government and their property taxes and transit, right? So people will have self-motivate, you know, and I see on Facebook people talking about all of these things. There's likely a story about this. I often learn things from Facebook groups that I belong to where people will be discussing what's happening in the area where I live. But it's not nearly as good as having a reporter who's kind of reliable and, you know. I think there's still a demand, it's just people don't want to pay for it.
There's still a lot of good journalism that's being made, including your own profile of Carney that was published in Maclean's very recently. Could you just maybe talk about a bit of how much work is required to produce journalism at that level?
Thank you for saying that. So my profile of Carney went up yesterday, and I'm getting a lot of positive feedback from it on social media and messages and so on, and that feels good. But I don't know if I'm going to do a whole lot more of this kind of thing, because the rates are just not that great. And I'm not really even blaming Maclean's magazine. I don't think they've got bags of money that they're keeping from me. I think like it's tough out there. And they asked me to do it, I think it was in June. I made my first phone call, and I worked on it until like 2 weeks ago. It was the summer, and I was doing some other things, but I was working on it, you know, all the time. And I spoke to dozens of people and read loads and loads of documents, and I feel like I reached a superior understanding of Carney by the end than I did at the beginning. And I really enjoy doing that kind of work. It was similar to the work I did to write a book about Justin Trudeau, and again, I'll remind you, Christmas is coming. I'm just kidding, actually. I don't think I will get any of the money if you buy a book, but it really is. I've worked hard over the years to have a reputation as a journalist who people can talk to, people particularly in politics, knowing that I'll keep my mouth shut about who has told me things. And I find it's a little frustrating to me that as I've kind of reached the position where I'm able to be that person in the Canadian political, not that person, there are other people who do the same kind of thing, but I've really focused on it. And, you know, at the same time when the money has kind of disappeared, right? Because I think it's valuable to have an in-depth look at these people, right? And, you know, I'm not about to give up. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so going back to, you had mentioned the stories of like the encampments but not being told in by journalists. Do you find that a lot of people also aren't willing to be interviewed and have their names put in articles that might be considered polarizing as well?
Yes, I think so, but there's, you know, knock on more doors is what I ask more people. I think that something it did not come naturally to me, but I eventually learned that I would have to be prepared to go into a Tim Hortons and bother everyone until I get quotes, you know what I mean? Or sit in the park and stop people walking past the park. It really, that's like I was kind of a slow learner, and I'm not naturally, don't want to bother people, but I think that's sort of like a journalistic superpower. Go bother people. Learn how to not let it bother you when they tell you when they swear at you, right? Okay, sorry, no, I don't want to bother you, right? You move on to the next person. Do that for a couple hours a day and you'll learn a lot.
We want to leave a little bit of time for people to buy their future Christmas presents and maybe bug you with some other questions as they have you sign their books.
Oh, certainly.
So it's been great having so many great questions, and wonderful having you here today, Stephen. So thank you very much.
Thank you.